Look alive. I clicked. We're live. Hi. Hi, Ville. Welcome to Culture of Grace.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
To start the show, I would love for the audience to get to know you a little bit more. So you started your career as a researcher in Finland, and then you have worked on your own company. So you're a founder from very early on, after the research era, and then you have worked at some iconic companies like Nokia and Netflix. Maybe we could talk about like what were some core lessons you've learned early on in your career, kind of shaping into who you are today.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, indeed. I studied in academia, of course, like way back when. That was where most people were doing machine learning, and of course AI. It's kind of interesting how this AI topic has had like these ups and downs. Actually, like when I was a grad student, it was actually an absolute taboo to call anything AI. I mean, in academia, you wouldn't be taken seriously if you call it AI. So there was like things like Bayesian statistics and machine learning. Of course, neural networks were there at the time as well. But yeah. So I mean, anyway, I mean, it wasn't as quite as like a hot as it's today. But anyway, already back then, it was obvious that like there were these emerging companies, of course, like Google and others already back then. Like, and it was obvious that they had a ton of data. And then, like being in academia, I saw that like, well, the data makes a huge difference. And it's a very, I mean, one can of course like theoretically develop models and ideas and so forth, but if you don't have data, I mean, there's only so far you can go. And then I decided that okay, I want to go to places like where they have a lot of data, so that at least like provides a great foundation. And then ended up like dropping out like from grad school, and then like joining companies and then founding companies.
For sure. Okay, so you have been working with data for a long time. I'm so curious about before we got into Outerbound, I want to point out that like you have created an open source product at Netflix called Metaflow. Maybe we could talk about like the science behind the Netflix era, because I think Netflix is a product that like everybody love, and then it's been like there for a while, and then I know that like I feel like there's a lot of like AI when people starting implementing back in, you started there at like 2019. Maybe we could talk about like what was the journey like to implement AI very early on,
Yeah.
and maybe we could talk about Metaflow, like how do you kind of like build it, and then since it's like an open source product, maybe we could talk about the open source aspect as
Mhm.
well, because there's like a huge debate on like open source and closed source.
Of course. Yeah. Well, yeah, no, I think that the interesting thing about all this is that on the one hand, companies have been building and systems using machine learning like for the longest time. Of course, companies like Netflix, some people may even remember that there was this thing called a Netflix prize, that they promised to give $1 million to somebody like who could improve their recommendation algorithm. And this was already, I don't even remember, like when was it, like
Wait, did
like
you win the $1 million prize?
yeah. Then so, yeah, it was some team that actually, like, the funny story about that is that it was a big competition. I mean, it was enough money that like many people really took it seriously. Of course, gave them a lot of publicity. But the thing is that they actually, like, even though they paid the $1 million, they didn't end up using the winning entry as is. It's also like a good example of the industry overall, that there are things that theoretically might give you the best results, but are just like a too inconvenient to use operationally. And then like kind of when you are actually doing these things in production, there are other concerns than like just the pure performance. So that was one thing. But yeah, like so I joined Netflix 2017, and the reason why I joined the company is that first, of course, as some people may know, they had this like a really peculiar culture. They like had like this original culture deck that like had some like pretty controversial statements, like kind of if you are meeting expectations, you will be fired, or something like that. Like where the idea basically was really set the bar high, which of course, like in some sense, is also like really, really exciting. And then the other thing that like really excited me is that I've been like always like very bullish about the cloud and the cloud computing, and Netflix was one of the first marquee customers of AWS, and they have been trailblazing many of the cloud kind of computing like patterns and best practices, like the chaos engineering and so forth. And then it was really interesting to me see that, okay, like in an environment that historically has been really, really good at cloud computing, and then we have this emerging field of like kind of using really machine learning in production, like what happens in the intersection. And now, of course, I mean, today, I mean, it's a like a much more like a well understood field. But I mean, even like back in 2016, 2017, this predates the term MLOps and so forth. I mean, it was much less clear what needs to be done. At the same time, why Netflix wanted to do this was purely like for business purposes, that they needed to improve their business. They use machine learning in all kinds of places. And also they didn't do this as an academic exercise. But then it was really like that, okay, we have to make this work for real because the business needs it. And at the same time, I always thought that like, well, I mean, like if we can figure this out for Netflix, it could potentially benefit many other companies as well, which kind of ended up happening things.
For sure. For the machine learning, like what were they trying to do? Is that like the algo trying to, I mean, obviously Netflix has a ton of data and like entertainment in general. Like, what does it mean to build like a human-centered machine learning infrastructure at Netflix?
Yeah. I think that I've been studying maybe it's first starting with the use cases. So actually, like even if you go to the Netflix tech blog that's online, they have many articles there about the different use cases spanning the question that like how do you even decide like what kind of TV shows and movies to produce? I mean, like they spend a lot of money, like more than $10 billion every year, and you don't want to waste the money, right? So you can kind of use data like to help that question. They're like very many practical questions. How do you translate subtitles, and how do you optimize the network streaming experience? Many of us like will be like watching Netflix Friday afternoon, and like everybody hates the spinning wheel when it's just buffering, and like actually it doesn't happen that often with Netflix, and it's actually a lot of engineering and even machine learning systems that like make that happen. So all kinds of things. So now the other part of your question about the human-centric, well, one realization which I still think holds true today is that it is people like building these systems at the end of the day. It's not that some AI co-pilots, agents just like build these systems like out of nothing. And then the really interesting thing, which still, I mean, the world is changing a bit, but I mean, it's still like true that the people who typically build these machine learning systems, they didn't come from a software engineering background. They didn't necessarily come from like a cloud engineering DevOps background, but they came from more like a science background. Like I have worked with many people like who studied, of course, like a statistics, but I mean also like other fields like a physics, even like whatever biology and like so forth. And then the thing is that like these people are absolutely amazing, like when it comes to data and like modeling and understanding the domain. But then like they are not necessarily software engineers, like building Docker images and like working with CI/CD. So the question, and to your point about the human centricity, was the idea that the kind of a main lever that we have is to basically take all that like amazing talent that these people have and like help to kind of a channel that like to these systems. But the system needs to be easy enough to use so that like the people can really kind of like use their like kind of skills in the best possible manner. And I think like a bit of a usual like a challenge that happens when engineers build systems that, well, I mean, of course, like as anyone, I mean, you kind of know the engineering sensibilities and you are excited about Kubernetes and YAML and CI/CD. And then the idea is that, okay, let's just expose these things. But I mean, then like if you are coming from a different background, you really couldn't care less about these things. And then the question is that, okay, how do we make it go away, while then like being realistic of the fact that it would be easy then to say that, okay, here's some magical button and you click the magic button and then things happen. But that's not like how real world works anyway. So it's the really sensitive balance that like you need to have enough flexibility. You don't need to dumb down the systems. That would be the other extreme. But at the same time, like kind of it can't be so that it exposes too much of the kind of the internals and the cognitive overhead. And that's kind of really the whole idea of open source Metaflow that we studied at Netflix. And I think that's why it has been resonating so well. But it's really like hitting that like a difficult balance in the middle.
For sure. Maybe we could talk about like, the impact of Metaflow before we jump into Outerbounds. Like, I guess like since it's open source, like I guess like what would you say for the infrastructure? I guess like what is the most, oh my gosh, sorry. What is the most difficult part about building the infrastructure? And then when people say infrastructure, what does it entail? Like for people who are like more business minded or like who are like non-technical, I guess like obviously it is like where I guess like the model is like kind of like built on on a high level, but like what is it how does it like kind of like empowering all these other AI applications to like keep functioning basically?
Yeah. I think like, yeah, to a question that like building infrastructure, I think if you think like, okay, so what is like infrastructure overall? I mean, like even in our like real world, I mean, we have things like plumbing and roads and like whatever, like the utilities and electricity and so forth. And one thing kind of that we like about that type of infrastructure is that like it shouldn't fail. I mean, like if you have potholes on the road, or like if you're like a plumbing fails, or like there's an electricity blackout, those things are really, really annoying. and people absolutely hate it. And then the second thing that you don't want the infrastructure to do is that it shouldn't change, like at least unannounced, like not too often. So somehow, like if somebody decides to reroute the road to your house, or like kind of say that, okay, oh, by the way, like we decided to change the plumbing, so now you only get like a cold water or something, those things are absolutely horrible. So the special thing about building infrastructure is really this idea that it should provide a stable foundation. And now the especially challenging thing, and this is almost like an oxymoron, that like in a field that is moving so fast as AI these days, like how on earth can you even like build something that is stable, like while then allow all the innovation, all the changes to happen? And honestly, this is an industry-wide like a question and challenge even today with AI, and that's why you see all the VCs like running around that, okay, like what kind of a infrastructure AI will need in the future. But I mean, kind of because things are changing so rapidly, like it's very hard to kind of put your finger on it. And I think that's something that like we really started thinking, and the way we thought about it is that there are things that will always change fast, like the models will change. It's very hard to say that always everybody will be using Llama or like whatever it might be. Those things change, and like even the kind of the Python libraries change. I mean, you know, like when we started, TensorFlow used to be a big thing, and like now most people use PyTorch, and like I don't know, maybe people will use something else in the future. But then there are like things that are like a fundamentally more stable. Like let's say, how do you access compute resources? I mean, the idea that, okay, I have a piece of Python code and I want to run it in the cloud. I mean, that's a pretty foundational need. That sounds more like infrastructure. So the idea with Metaflow is that, okay, let's start with those stable kind of foundations, and let's build kind of from the bottom up. And then like, let's leave more freedom at the top of the stack. So we don't need to be opinionated about what is the best modeling framework or what is the best API for inference, or like even like a feature engineering is a good example, that we even like shied away from saying that this is the way how everybody needs to do feature engineering. But then the idea is that it's really, again, like hitting the balance in the middle, that like then with some things like we can afford being a bit more opinionated. For instance, that like we don't say that, oh, like you figure out the Docker container and like kind of that's your problem. No, I mean, that's something that like we can say that like most people want to more focus on the actual like business logic and not what goes inside the Docker container.
For sure. I want to jump into, oh, by the way, hi, Luis. I want to say hi for our audience who comments. Okay, so why don't we talk about Outerbounds? So like, I know that you created Metaflow, and then how is it related to Outerbounds? And then what were something that, wow, the journey of like creating Metaflow that you kind of like uncovered?
Right.
Like what would be one piece of insight that you feel like you built your company based on?
Right. Well, now, of course, like overall, like when it comes to founding of new companies, like founding startups, a lot has been said and like written about the topic. Of course, like one of the key questions is that like you should be addressing a real need that exists in the world. I mean, like it's really important that you don't just like see that you have a hammer and then like everything looks like a nail. So one like a nice thing about us being able to open source Metaflow at Netflix was this idea that like even before starting the company, we were able to see that, okay, is this approach even something that like resonates like with the industry? So it was a bit of a, you know, like a market research experiment to see that, okay, like do people care? Is there any like attraction to this? And that's why we open sourced Metaflow back in 2019. And then like many of the logos that you like showed there as well, then they started reaching out to Netflix, and you can now imagine that like a company like Netflix is not interested in helping. You can see that there are many companies in very different industries, life sciences and banks, and like, yeah, Netflix is like, they have super awesome business that they need to run. They are not in the business of helping everybody else. So then in 2021, we were at a bit of an inflection point, that there was sufficient market demand that we saw that, okay, this could be a big thing. Of course, like it's important to remind everybody that this was before ChatGPT, so AI wasn't quite as hot as it's today. And then, yeah, but I mean, then it was obvious that, okay, we want to do this for real. And that's when we then like decided to found Outerbounds, like with the idea that, okay, I mean, like we know that there's a lot of demand, increasing amount of demand, like to do these things at companies, different type of machine learning AI things. And we have roughly an idea that like what kind of a product would help these companies. I mean, of course, didn't know exactly. It's always an exploration. But yeah, so then like I just started building the platform. And again, I mean, the benefit with open source is that it allowed us to talk to many different teams, understand their pain points, what are the things that they would like to solve by themselves, like what are the things that they wouldn't like to solve by themselves. and of course, then like it was obvious that like the usual like enterprise questions that like all companies face, like authentication, authorization, things like that came up, and we then like started building the Outerbounds platform that then like helps you then to run these workloads with all those kind of like a pretty mundane enterprise concerns covered. And then we of course like over time we have been adding a lot, and especially like a following the crazy AI market that's been now going on for 3 years.
For sure. Hi, Professor Ixon, and then Lewis is saying PyTorch is being used more than TensorFlow. Okay, so maybe we could talk about the Slack group, and then we could talk about like the product itself. So since you're selling to, I think if you're selling to Warner Bros. And Realtor.com, it's probably like 2 different set of product, or like 2 different type of like, even for the engineer who are building with very unique experiences, right? So what does a productizing and sales process kind of look like for you at the very early on?
Yeah. Well, we knew that there are like a certain like a hard things that like most companies like needed to solve. Like we kind of and this is probably bad advice like for any founders, because like especially these days there's a lot of pressure to produce ARR really quickly, and this idea that like you start like building something that's hard and it might take a while and so forth. So probably I don't know if it even like works in today's climate, but the idea is that we knew that things like, okay, like how can we like operate something in the customer's environment, because the big difference what we do is that we don't ask enterprises to send data to us, like we always deploy in their environment. So this like a bring your own cloud model. And that's kind of technically much harder. I remember like even engineers like were just like in the early days of the company saying that, oh, can't we just like do the SaaS thing, because then like we control everything and we don't have to deal with their environment and so forth. But we knew that in order to work with these larger enterprises, it's absolutely a non-starter that they would be sending their data to us or compute. So we started by building that. We knew that the distribution is super important. And the idea, and this was actually something that I had always like followed AWS with great admiration, that of course AWS, ever since the early days of the cloud, they had been listening to customers very actively. It's not that they had Jeff Bezos had a grand vision that oh, like this is like the zillion services they had on AWS, but it was so that they provided some basic functionality, compute and data, EC2, S3 in the early days, and then like a really easy way to start using these services. And then they listen to the customer that, okay, like what do people do? What do people want? And we had the same idea that, okay, can we first like have this like platform that we can deploy in the customer's environment, and then we start working closely with them and understand like what are the most pressing needs. And that's kind of, so hence we thought that even before like knowing or thinking exactly that like what are all the product features, we knew that like we have to get the distribution right, and that's how we started, and that choice turned out to be like very, very successful. I mean, that's the only way how we have been able to kind of get to work with these large companies.
For sure. I want to say hi to Ayan, and then Lewis is saying the Metaflow Slack channel is amazing. I wonder, so you mentioned about like the distribution matters, right? So like open source is kind of like a distribution channel to a degree. And I guess like when you are packaging your product to sell, like at what point do you transition from like a free open source situation to like a paid product?
Right. No, that's absolutely the kind of the most core question to any company operating with open source. And I think like in my eyes, I mean, if you allow me to take like a bit of a kind of a longer road here, is that there have been like I've been following open source like for a very long time, and I've been like following with great interest the businesses that have been built with open source. And I guess there was this like a really the early days of open source, like when it was really like driven by the ideology and so forth. And many companies just thought that, okay, like we have this amazing open source, and then something happens. Of course, the original model was maybe run like a consultancy. We just provide professional services. But then the idea was that, okay, like we develop everything in open, and then like we have some kind of like a commercial offering on top of that. And then like what started happening is that, of course, especially with the cloud, AWS and of course like other clouds as well became really good at taking open source software, things like Redis and Elasticache and Postgres and many others, and then like packaging them up as a very kind of enticing commercial solutions, but in such a way that didn't give much back to the original creators of the open source. And like there were like many debates and like many hurt feelings, and then like of course like potentially much money lost and so forth. So then like the companies and like behind open source projects started getting much more careful, like with different licenses, that okay, like you have like a MongoDB was always like this like AGPL license that somebody couldn't just take it and provide it as a commercial service and so forth. So that's one model. And of course, like some projects ended up changing the license on the fly, which always is super like disruptive, and like you can kind of lose the credibility and the trust of the community. So learning from all these experiences, a couple of things that we didn't want to do is that first, I mean, we absolutely didn't want to end up in a situation where somehow we would have to change the license. And one thing that helps in our cases as well is that even today, Metaflow is under Netflix. And whenever like I get asked that, okay, what if like your VCs force you to change the license or something like that, I tell that, okay, maybe, who knows? But I mean, like at least like the project is under Netflix, and like you can be assured that like Netflix is a company, they won't be, they are not like trying to suddenly start like selling you B2B like a ML and AI platform. So that won't happen. But then of course the question is that the company does need to make money. It needs to be long-term sustainable. And really the nicest pattern that I have seen this how this works overall in the industry is where you have this like open source kind of like the API layer, if you will, that like, because nobody wants to have like a vendor lock-in in a sense that like you just use proprietary APIs and then like your application is really super tight to some service, like let it be whatever, AWS SageMaker. Everybody likes open source with the idea that they can take the kind of a thing that they have built and they can like decide where to run it. So that's a good model. But then on the other hand, like not many companies necessarily want to have a huge platform team operating the infrastructure, the underlying underpinnings that need to power the APIs. And that's the approach that we have taken, that even as of today, Metaflow is the API layer. Like all those APIs work as is, both in open source as Outerbounds. But if you don't want to operate all the machinery, all the like authentication, authorization, like a multi-cloud, like a different like environments, like workstations there, like a zillion features there, I mean, then like you can come to our platform. But again, I mean, the really key thing is that the APIs are always open source, always will be open source, and like you always have the option of like kind of just taking everything that you have built and like move it elsewhere.
For sure. What is your opinion on like the competitive landscape? Correct me if I'm wrong. I think Base10 is also in the space, and like Foundry and stuff like that. So like, or Helicon. So like, I guess like, how do you think about the space in general? And then, I mean, obviously, I feel like you guys started at the point that like right before AI was like very like popular as like a mainstream situation. But like, I guess like, what's your thought on the overall landscape, and then how do you think about the differentiation piece as well?
Yeah. No, that's of course super key as well. Now, one interesting thing is that like some of you may remember that back in 2021, like when Outerbounds was also founded, there were like a couple of really big trends before the AI boom. And like there was the thing called modern data stack that I guess there was a blog article by A16Z, like where they had this like a whole like a new data ecosystem, and there were like many layers, many different types of services around that. And then there was this other big thing which was called MLOps. And I think like one thing that was common in like the thinking around like both of these like a market landscape ideas, or like how the market gets segmented, was that they're like a tiny slivers of segments. Like let's say on the MLOps side, you have things like experiment trackers, and you had things like a feature stores, and then of course like you had a model monitoring solutions, and like even like whatever model drift solutions, and all kinds of things, kind of addressing different point challenges. Now, from our point of view, coming from Netflix, like we always felt that like all of those things kind of make sense. I mean, it's not that people were somehow kind of just like hallucinating, but the problem was that like solving any one of those like individual challenges like wouldn't be quite enough, right? And the idea was that there's this like a big idea of like kind of what the practice of MLOps, and it was like a hand wavy big thing. And then like kind of many companies struggled understanding that, okay, how do we implement MLOps? Kind of, well, there's MLflow, but I mean, like that doesn't do compute, it doesn't do orchestration. So anyway, like too many individual pieces. It was like just way too fragmented. And we had this vision that instead of like trying to come up with the new category or put us in a specific category, like we really do want to provide like enough functionality that people can actually like build the actual system end to end. And this of course comes from our DNA at Netflix as well, that like, well, I mean, we really need to be able to ship the end result, and like even if we have the fanciest feature store, like if we can't like get the thing to production, it kind of nothing matters, right? So that was the idea, and that was that was kind of like a bit controversial, like back in the day, because then like many VCs and everybody kind of struggled that, okay, like, wait a minute, are you an orchestrator? Is this an experiment tracker? Because it didn't quite like fit into that landscape. Now, many years later, of course, it is a sad fact that like not many companies from that market map ended up surviving, because the fact is that like many of those markets were like defined too tightly, and especially customers, they felt that, I mean, we don't want to have 7 different vendors. And I think that was a problem a bit with the modern data stack, that like you ended up working with many tiny different vendors and things didn't work together so well. So anyway, so now there has been a lot of consolidation and like many vendors, and that's when even like you look at the cloud default solutions like a SageMaker and Vertex, the idea is that they try to provide like a lot of functionality, so it's kind of like a single stop shop. And of course, Databricks that you showed there before as well is a great example, Snowflake of course as well. So I think like now we are at this like a very interesting kind of state in the industry. Like first, I mean, there's of course like a way more demand and interest because of AI. At the same time, the AI field by itself has been like moving so fast that there's a lot of confusion also, that like, okay, like which parts like from the world before like in November 2022 when ChatGPT came out makes sense, and is the world different now? Is it the vector DB that matters, or is it some kind of RAG system that matters? Of course, agentic things have been a big thing for this year, and there has been like a lot of confusion, and of course some companies that have been doing well, some companies that haven't done so well. And our like a view is actually like a very much still like kind of the same vision that we always have had, that the foundations, you want to have the stable foundations. And especially like in this market, if you go to NVIDIA's like the GTC conferences, Jensen is always talking about the compute and how there will be so much compute available. And I think that's absolutely a key part of the stack. Of course, the data won't go anywhere. The fact that you need to orchestrate, whether you orchestrate agents or like LLMs, that won't go away. So we still have that vision, and like we are executing against that vision. And the one thing that benefits us is that like we have been so consistently doing it that we have this like compounding benefits of having done that. And like to your question that like what is the differentiation, is that it is also like a fact that we have been now doing this like kind of like almost like a longer than, at least when it comes to open source, than like pretty much like anybody else. And then we have been doing this with customers. So like now the feature set that like we have, it is just it's just like way more mature. So if you look at there was like a recent like a Cloud Native Computing Foundation report where they like ranked different open source tools, and then like they had surveyed people, and like people like ranked Metaflow at the top when it comes to usefulness and when it comes to maturity. And this is direct result of the fact that like we have been just like consistently executing, and also like showing that we are like very much like a true to our word, and like we haven't been breaking the foundation. And that's something that I think increasingly like people appreciate now, and there has been so much like a movement in the AI space that it's impossible to build otherwise anything that's production qualities.
For sure. I wonder, so when you're landing these big logos, obviously I think the first one might be like Netflix, as it is like your, previous company that you have worked at, like, and then when you're branching out to like other sector, especially let's call it like the real estate, the manufacturing, or like the delivering or whatever, how do you identify like which bracket have like the biggest amount of cash to flow into the infrastructure deployment or
Right.
like infrastructure segment?
Yeah, like my rule of thumb has always been that doing AI and machine learning is most exciting when it's actually the CFO that cares about the results and not the CTO. So, I mean, of course, like AI and ML is super cool. So it's very easy to get CTOs excited and like, oh, look, we are building the AI thing and so forth. And there are many companies that like want to, and even before the AI, that wanted to sprinkle, let's say, the fairy dust that like, look, we have a recommendation system and so forth. We had many companies who came to us saying that, oh, Netflix is famous for its recommendation system. We want to have a recommendation system on our site. And then there's a bit of a question that, okay, like you are selling 7 products, how much difference does it make anyways? So there's that. But I mean, then there's the other part, which is that like when it's the CFO, meaning that like there's a direct connection between the quality and the stability and the flexibility of your ML and AI and the money that the company is making. And it's just that like companies get so much more motivated to do the right thing, like when it actually has a direct effect on the bottom line. And now, so it happens that there are like a couple of industries where this has always been the case. Like one is financial services. So like you can look at many of the financial services companies, And let's say like the classic example is always fraud detection. So your company, your financial services company lives or dies by the quality of the fraud detection. And this like has been true since the days of PayPal, that like the fraud can kill your company, right? So you have to do that well. And then the other example might be, let's say, life sciences, like let's say modern drug discovery. I mean, now we are serving many of these companies who have their custom models to like find compounds and like do whatever, like a protein folding and so forth. And that's the whole thing that the company does. The company wouldn't exist like if they didn't like have those models. So then there's absolutely like a one-to-one relationship between the company and the models. So to your question, like how do we find like a kind of our ideal customer profile? It's really those companies like for whom this is absolutely central. And now, of course, the kind of a interesting thing about this like AI industry now is that, well, I mean, kind of like everybody has been forced to pay attention to AI. But now, like we are seeing an increasing number of companies who see that, wait a minute, we can either like reinvent our existing business using AI, and then it becomes absolutely like one-to-one important, or like new businesses who are like building the whole thing from the ground up using AI. And then, of course, there's many companies who are just like dabbling and demoing and like doing POCs and yeah, I mean, of course, usually these companies come to us like when they are ready to get a bit more serious about what they do.
For sure. When you are thinking about like your 2026 roadmap as a CEO, like how do you think about the product side, the team side, as well as the like I guess like the client side? So for example, I guess like would you launch like I guess like what is on your product roadmap to land in like 2026, and then how do you think about like getting maybe $100 million ARR, or maybe now like even the benchmark is a lot higher sometimes, like at what speed? Because I think I don't know if you benchmark yourself for like with other companies, or like do you bench yourself like with the current existing client base? Like how do you think about achieving the $100 million ARR at some point?
Yeah, that's it. Well, I mean, maybe I'll like start with that question. I mean, one like a thing that I have done like to annoy some VCs is to ask that like if you look at the top companies today, if you look at like companies like Databricks and like maybe Snowflake and Datadog and like even public companies, and then you ask that how many of those companies like would be funded as of today if they were like started today, or let's say they had maybe raised their pre-seed or seed, and then they like Datadog came to you or Databricks came to you saying that, okay, we are this like year-old company and we have this ARR and so forth, that now like can we raise like whatever seed or series A? And the funny thing is that like most of those companies that are making absolutely like crazy amount of money today, they wouldn't get funded in today's climate. Like, because the idea is that, wait a minute, I mean, like you are not at the 100 million ARR, even though like the company is already like whatever, like kind of a year old or something. And I think it's of course like a very much like a effect of this market. And also like one thing that doesn't get talked like enough is the fact that there are also these cases where the company grew super fast, and then like also like then the revenue tanked. So easy come, easy go. And there's of course in our industry, there's always the tendency of like a focus on these like really happy stories, which is great. And I'm all for like optimism and all that. But I mean, it's of course also like it needs to be counterbalanced by the fact that eventually, like even like for like the VCs and then any investor, like the companies need to be long-term sustainable. They need to provide like a long-term value. And of course, there's always the kind of the signaling that the idea that if the company grows really fast, it must be doing something that's super amazing. Now, I think that the AI market has distorted that a bit, because there are these things that like look super cool and people get excited and everybody piles on top of it, and like you may even produce quick ARR, but it's not necessarily a signal that's something that will produce value in the long term. So there's much of the novelty effect that has been happening. And anyway, I mean, all this is to say that we still kind of maybe in this market in a slightly contrarian fashion believe that like, well, we want to build a long-term business. And like, I don't think that the business fundamentals really have changed so much. That like how these companies should get built and will get built. And of course, it's also like the other thing that's super important is that we are still in such early days of the AI market, that of course it's one thing that you chase the kind of the quickest return in this market. And I think it's definitely like a valid way. It's almost like a day trading that, yes, I mean, maybe at least if you can exit your position quickly, it might make sense. But then like the other thing is that if you think that like we are really in the early innings, in the early phases of the industry, and then like still I would say that the main prize is way ahead of us. if you think of company like Shopify, so if you think about the e-commerce, I mean, when was Shopify founded? I don't know, like 2010 or something, and then like a super early days for e-commerce. And I'm pretty sure that like they grew decently, but I mean, nothing too crazy in the early days. But I mean, when did like a Shopify become this like behemoth? I mean, it really like needed to wait for the market maturation as well. And I think that absolutely the same thing is with the AI, that kind of we are all like kind of there's so much like a hype and like a buzz going around like of this early market, that, like we kind of even forget that even the bigger price is like way ahead of us. So.
How do you think about the spending side of things? Because a lot of like AI companies, especially in the infra space, spend most of the money in GPU and stuff like that. So like, how do you think about the profit margin for an AI company in 2026?
Right. Well, now overall, like I'm super bullish on the fact that like we and like when I say we, I mean like we as a humankind, like we have access to way more compute power than ever before. And like I think like one day somebody will like draw a chart that like how much compute power is at our disposal easily, and that chart has absolutely skyrocketed over the past couple of years. I mean, and like it's just, of course, like much thanks to NVIDIA that now you have all these neo clouds like the CoreWeaves and the Nebuses and the RunPods and Together.ai's of the world that like give you access to this absolutely massive amount of compute power, which is super awesome. But now the problem that everybody has is that the demand side hasn't matured enough to understand how to best leverage the compute power. Of course, like you have your OpenAIs there, and like you have your Microsofts there, and like you can always like spend infinite amount of compute on like trying to post-train another model and so forth. But I mean, those are like still like a pretty kind of a specialized companies, and then the ROI of doing that is not quite clear at this point. But the interesting thing in the long term is that like how do we actually turn those compute cycles into value? And right now the problem is, of course, that like we have been like creating a ton of supply in the market. That's why I mean like NVIDIA's valuation is what it is. And I think that the demand is like kind of lagging behind. I mean, I know that the inference, for instance, is something that the main way how if you have a bunch of GPUs and you think that, oh my gosh, I need to kind of turn these GPUs into dollars, how do I do that? Well, kind of the best maybe, and the kind of the only idea that I may have today is that, okay, I just like slap some inference on top of that. And I think that's okay. I mean, inference is always needed. I think it's also like a bit of a lack of imagination that it just happens to be the only thing that everybody is doing at this point. So I'm fully expecting that like we will have much more like a creative ways of monetizing GPUs, hopefully already next year, and like of course like over the years to come. But it is also like a fact that if that's the only idea that you have, I mean, it is a super crowded market. The kind of the prices are going down. I don't think that that's like a long-term sustainable. But at the same time, I mean, many smart companies in the space, I mean, they are kind of fully aware of that and like are looking to diversify, coming up with new ideas.
I wonder, so like when you're thinking about your space, what are some like tools that you feel like should be built, but now it's like not existing?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing is absolutely that I'm super eager to wait for like really kind of, how should I put it, like AI native consumer applications. So I gave this presentation already a couple of years ago. How I think kind of first and foremost, I think like AI is really a great new user interface paradigm. It is a new way how we can interact with computers, which then means that like we can totally like reimagine like many kind of product experiences so that it's not like a drop downs and buttons and so forth. And like still as of today, we are in this like oddball like situation like where we have a like one leg in the past and one leg in the future, that like we have these interfaces that have buttons and drop downs, and then there's the AI chatbot in the corner. And that I'm sure that in like a 10 years time that will look so silly that like what on earth were we thinking that like we had this text box and then like you click buttons and text box and talk to an AI. So to answer your question, so I think what I'm really excited to start like when like a first kind of startups come out that are really reimagining the experiences, kind of in the same way as, let's say, Instagram, like back in the day when the camera phones were new. I mean, there were all these applications that like, oh, like, yeah, let's take a photo on a camera, and it's almost like this old school camera app and like whatnot. And then there was this idea that like, wait a minute, I mean, we can totally reimagine the whole, like, what does it mean, like kind of to kind of have a camera phone and take a photos, and you have filters, and it's much more about the emotion that like creating kind of a fancy like a photos and like whatnot. So yeah, so I think that that's super exciting. And then, yeah, definitely on the more like on the backend side, I think, yeah, I mean, we will need like way more ideas and better ideas, like how to turn the compute into value. I think that there's a ton to be done there, and I mean, across the industries, and I think like pretty much everywhere. But I think it takes time. But I mean, like people should really think that, okay, what kind of things are now suddenly possible, like thanks to the amount of compute.
I wonder, since you mentioned about like consumer application, and AI native consumer application, what does AI native meant to you?
Yeah, well, it really means that like you are like thinking kind of the whole business from the ground up, like thinking. I mean, and not like kind of thinking like what might be possible in the future, but I mean like really thinking what are the tools available today, and then like building the company like with those like parameters, and like the user interface is really a big part of that. I think like one thing is like, yeah, really the fact that now like we have a language, like we have voice. I mean, things are becoming much more human-centric in that point of view. It's kind of paradoxical that we have this AI, which is kind of really a sci-fi piece of tech and like kind of fancy math and like whatnot. But then at the end of the day, what it enables is to create experiences that are much closer to humans than ever before. And I think like people are pushing it, but I think also the interesting thing is that I think it can have like pretty deep like implications to the whole like a business model as well, and not just that, okay, you take an existing business and then you release a new mobile app, but I mean like really even that, okay, how do you kind of like, I think that I don't know even like what are the best segments, like consumer like kind of a segments where it might change things, but I think that there will be many.
What is I guess like, can I understand it as kind of like multimodal vibe? So basically like the voice agent interact with like your other agents that are like, beyond like ChatGPT obviously, but what is your thought on like the agent orchestration layer? So I feel like AI agent has been like a very buzzy word this year, but like what would you say would be like next year's like AI agent?
Yeah. Well, I think like here's my like a hot take on the kind of the agent question, that I think that the agents are so popular mainly because of the word agent. Because like if you think that at the end of the day, like the LLMs and everything, they are like at the end of the day, it kind of boils down that it's somebody's Python code running somewhere. So you could as well like call everything that it's a tool. But now the question is that like, would you rather like be kind of managing like a 15 different tools, or like would you rather manage 15 agents? And it's just like a sounds and feels so much cooler that you are like this like a puppet master, like kind of directing your agent army to do things. And I think that's why it's so appealing, emotionally appealing to talk about the agents. Now, like to your question, I think at the end of the day, what the agents are is really, it's just a kind of a more like a versatile way to interact with large language models and so forth, where it's not only that you send a prompt and you get the response and that's it, but it's really the idea that, okay, you keep doing this in a loop, and like then you may introduce other tools in the process and so forth. And I think that idea, let's put the label agent aside because it's so loaded at this point, but I mean this idea that like we can use LLM as a very versatile component directing how the whole like a system behaves, I think that's of course absolutely a no-brainer good idea. Now, I think like from my point of view, the interesting question, and kind of like really one of the core things with Metaflow and Outerbounds, what we are doing is that I think that this is more like even of a kind of new way of building software. So all the systems of the future, they will have these models and they will have data, and they of course like will have code as before. And then it's like a very intricate like interconnections that like what are the things you want to put in the code, and like what are the decisions made by the LLM, and like what kind of context or like data is needed in the system. And overall, like when we talk, let's say, about the agent orchestration, I think like the question that people are like trying to go after is the question that like, how do we architect systems like where LLMs are a critical part of the system, and then like of course the challenge is that like there's a lot of entropy, there's a lot of like a stochasticity in the system, things are not deterministic, so that's why you have to design the whole system in a different way. But I view it more like from the angle that, okay, like how do we architect software like this? And yes, having some kind of a like orchestration engine, of course, like having some kind of a DAG, maybe some kind of finite state machine like might be useful, but I don't think that that's the end game necessarily. And I think that that's the another area of innovation. that I kind of hope that maybe it won't be just like called agents. I think it's kind of a bit like, at one point everybody was super excited about the object orientation in engineering, and everything was an object, and it kind of made sense. It made so much sense that everything is an object, like kind of course. And then now it kind of so much makes sense that everything is an agent. But look, that's just one way of looking at it, and like we can kind of get to the same end result, but just like take a different angle that might actually like lead to better systems anyways.
I wonder, in the MLOps market, what are some newer like innovation that you feel like are coming up?
Yeah, well, I have to say, like, and then tell my honest opinion that I think that there has been absolute lack of innovation. I think that it's kind of odd that like how little innovation there has been, that so many like copycat companies like doing exactly the same thing. And it's always odd that like why, especially startups, that it kind of feels that like, well, anyway, you are taking a shot in the darkness, so at least like try something that's very new, and then like you end up like creating another, I don't know, like a experiment tracker or like another like a orchestrator or something like that, and so forth. So yeah, I think that like I would love to see even more, and like people like pushing the boundaries. I do understand the market pressures there, of course, that it's hard to then like sell people on a whole like a novel idea. But yeah, I think that there has been definitely like many kind of shots, like let's say like a vector DBs were super cool at one point. It kind of felt, and I was always that, well, I wasn't like so like a bullish on the idea back then. I think like the big thing, and I think like where like the innovation like will happen, like going back to my previous answer as well, is this question that, okay, how do we architect these systems where like LLMs are a key piece? I think that like we are kind of teasing kind of some key pieces. I think, for instance, like what Temporal is doing with this whole idea of durable execution and so forth, those, I think that they are like really interesting ideas there. The other one for sure is, of course, the state management. So people talk about the memory systems. I think that there's a lot to be thought like there, that, okay, like how do we manage this like a state, and also not only like a store the state. I think that's the kind of an easy part, but also like kind of a manipulate and compress the state for agents. So I think that there's stuff happening there. And then it's always like a fun to think that like at the end of the day, these are business critical production systems. So it still will be always people operating these systems, which then like brings us to the question of observability. And there are like a couple of industries that always follow whatever big paradigm shifts happen. Like one of them is the security industry. Enterprises are always concerned that like something bad might happen, so that there will be definitely, and of course already now, like all kinds of security things happening. And then the other one is that, okay, how do we operate these models in an enterprise environment safely, and like kind of manage the whole life cycle so that they don't just like change overnight and so forth. So I think that there are like things to be done there. So I think that these things will always take surprisingly long. We always feel that the industry is moving so fast, but I think the innovation cycles are surprisingly long.
Wow. I wonder, what's your AI stack in your own company? What are like some department that you felt like maybe you could give us an overview on, like, how many employees, and then like how many people are like actually building, like on the edge team building the product itself, and then what is the kind of like sales. I met some of your salespeople at the at the Approva event.
Yeah, the AI native, yeah.
The Approva event. I know it's native, but yeah. Okay, so maybe we could talk about like, how do you kind of like leveraging AI in your own like AI stack, and then what are parts that you feel like will never be able to replace by AI, and then what are things that you will AIify immediately?
Yeah. Well, maybe starting like from the obvious, like the code gen, like definitely big fans of Claude Code. I have to say that like the interesting thing is that I'm like, like how there are these people who say that, okay, all the software engineering has totally changed, and like kind of we just have this like whatever, I have 15 Claude codes like writing 100,000 lines of code for me every day. There's that camp, and then there's the other like a grumpy camp that, oh, this is horrible and nothing works. I'm absolutely like a solidly in the middle, that I think that in certain areas it is absolutely like game changing. That like, for instance, like whenever like we want to create like a small internal applications, like a dashboards or like a Streamlit apps or reports, oftentimes can just one shot that, and it works amazingly well. And then like I'm also like surprised that then there are some areas of more esoteric things that people haven't done before, and then these tools like fail surprisingly soon and surprisingly badly. And I'm always feel especially bad for people who that don't necessarily have the expertise to evaluate the results, and then these models and the agents are like outputting like utter crap, and then like you don't know if you can't look at the code by yourself. So anyway, so like very much like we are cautiously using, I mean, having great success like with the code generation in some domains, like much less success in some other domains, which I'm sure that like applies to many others here as well. Now to your question about the overall like organization and AI, I think like a sales, I mean, like a sales benefits like hugely from AI. I think that that's definitely like there are like so many things like where we can do overall like understanding the market. Like one of the specific challenges that we have like when it comes to go to market is the fact that like our product is decently complex. Also like we have absolutely like operating in this like a sprawling market, like where you can imagine that like you are a salesperson and like you're talking, let's say, about agents, and then like customer says that, okay, how is this different than like LangGraph? And then the salesperson says, wait a minute, so like kind of we have a comparison to LangChain. So how is LangChain different than LangGraph? And I guess now like they even have a third product, is called Deep Research and so forth. And then like kind of then there's the question that, okay, like how is LangGraph different than like AutoGen? Like, wait a minute, is it the same thing as like whatever OpenAI agent SDK and then so forth? So there's so much stuff happening. And I think like one place where AI definitely helps is that like if you just want to understand, and even on the fly, like you can go to ChatGPT and ask that, okay, like tell me the difference between LangChain and LangGraph. And it's just like a super convenient. Now, I mean, also like what we are absolutely like proud about is that like kind of in our industry, we have extremely discerning, very smart customers. So I don't think that like we would have much luck like sending some AI SDRs to kind of send emails to people. I think the market is getting so saturated with the AI personalized emails anyway. So
SDR need to be canceled.
Exactly. And to your question that like what won't change, I think, and you pointed out the kind of the real world event also, like where we met recently. And well, I mean, one thing is that it's still, I think it's going to be a long while like before we have robots like at the booth. And it's kind of odd that like because of this oversaturation of all the digital channels like email and even LinkedIn and so forth, like with the AI slop, the value of real world events has been going up. Because that's the one occasion, like when you talk to another entity, I mean, you can still be reasonably sure that when I was talking to Grace at the event, I hope that you are still there. I think Grace, not AI. Exactly. And I think it's maybe one day, like there will be some kind of a, like whatever, Elon Musk will make some amazing Android. But I mean, I think that's going to be a while. So
do you see the nano banana? So like I saw like, so someone showed me like a tweet of like people generated like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and like, I don't know, Jeff Bezos or something like in one room. And then people thought it was like a real picture. So it was like very insane, I feel like.
Yeah. No, it will be like a really fun to see, like even, of course, like we are getting close to the fact that like, for instance, this show, like a kind of, I mean, you could get like pretty close with Nano Banana. So, yeah, I think that'll be fun, like arms race and like between people trying to make things more interesting versus other generated stuff.
I wonder for like an open source project, I'm always curious about like, I know that you guys have a Slack group and like, obviously, I guess like, do you have to actively keep the Slack group activated, or like, do you feel like it's kind of like because people every day have some sort of questions, all of that, it's just like self-motivating?
I think it's definitely, I mean, what I'm happy about is that like people like do like know, and I think like one thing that's really nice about Slack is that you can see history. So like when people like join the Slack and they see like what kind of questions have been asked, so they kind of encourages people that, okay, it seems to be an active group. People, I mean, I know that like in our Slack, of course, we have as usual in internet, so there's like 100 times more like lurkers, people who are not actively posting, but I mean, they are very much like observing the answers. So one shouldn't underestimate that. But I mean, yes, people then do ask questions. Now, one downside of that, and like I really would like to improve the situation, is that we have this old, like really odd, like a survivor bias, that people only come to ask questions on the channel if they can't figure out the answer by themselves. So I mean, people are really nice in that sense that they don't want to bother, especially like with open source, that like it's not even paid. So I wouldn't like bother them like unless I really kind of haven't been able to figure it by myself. And as a result, the questions that we get are like actually like a pretty gnarly and sophisticated. And it makes it seem like that it's all like full of like a super smart people only solving the kind of the most difficult problems in the world, which puts the bar unnecessarily high. So I would always, And I think this is like an interesting challenge for internet communities, that I would like people to have a kind of a lower bar and like ask more like a simple questions, if you will, so that it wouldn't seem that it's only like this, like a super like kind of a
Super
like
intelligent.
yeah, exactly. So, but I mean, yeah, I think it's just a kind of a side effect of like kind of people being nice and like trying to do their homework, and all the easy problems are easy anyway, so only the kind of we hear about the hard ones.
For sure. I want to maybe like, because of like we have such a heavy like investment community kind of like listening, like the younger VCs and stuff like that. So like when you guys were and also like a bunch of startup founders, so like I guess like when you're thinking of fundraising, what would be like one thing that you felt like you've done right at the very beginning of your like fundraising journey, that kind of
Yeah.
like that you guys kind of apart? Because I think you guys are invested at all the actual, I feel like the top SaaS fund, or like the infra dev tooling kind of fund, right? Like Amplify,
Right.
Costa, Foundation Capital, Green Oaks. And I feel like those are mostly like just like people who are very infra and dev tool heavy funds, right? So it's
Right.
not like very generic funds that invest in everybody, but like how do you think about the fundraising journey early on?
Right. No, I mean, the one piece of advice, and especially like if there are any founders listening who would like to do something similar, I think that there's a like over obsession in the kind of the theatrics of like VCs and fundraising and pitch decks and like what are the magical words like in a Shark Tank, that you have 5 minutes and you have to awe the audience. And I don't think that that's how it works. Maybe in some cases, maybe that's how it works. But the thing that we did, and like I absolutely think that the path that is open to many, is that we kind of proved the value first. And the way we did it is that like we had the open source, like we had been helping people, helping companies, like we had kind of shown that this is something that works. It has the traction. I mean, I don't know about the product market fit. I mean, there's always a loaded term, but I mean, there were many companies who found it very valuable. And you can imagine that then like having any kind of funding discussions becomes so much easier, because this is not about me having kind of a shiny slides and like really convincing you that just believe me, but it's more so that, look, I mean, we have been talking to these companies, we know what they are doing, and this is why it works for them and so forth. So I know that this is, of course, like hard in a sense that there's everybody complains about the chicken and egg problem, that, well, how can I prove the value, like put all the hours in like before getting the funding and so forth. But I think like, especially these days, like open source, still the bar is kind of lower than ever. So you can start something, you can like start doing these things. I mean, even on LinkedIn, I mean, you can start posting about things and see if anybody cares, and like do that. And it's also like good for you, because of course there's a bit of a question that like if you can't get anybody interested, and know if the idea is that like a great to start with. So I mean, that's why I would like a kind of a not like mystify the fundraising process so much, but like really focus on the value creation, because I have a full conviction that like you can always get the best VCs of the world like interested, like if you can show that you are producing value, and especially like if the money follows the value, like it's a kind of a no-brainer. And then the question is that, okay, like, well, I'm not quite able to show the value and I'm not quite able to show the money, and like just believe me. Well, yeah, sure. I mean, sometimes that works, but I mean, that's a much harder path. So.
Wow, for sure. I wanna be mindful of the time. Maybe we do wrap with a quick fire round. But by the way, hi, I feel like Luis has been like killing with all the comments and stuff.
Thanks,
Maybe we'll
Luis.
talk about what's your favorite book?
Good question. Like one of the really influential book in the early days was like, like Richard Feynman has this book called like kind of a, like is it something like Why Should You Care, like what other people think, or something like that. So I think that was really like a good, like a kind of formative, that like, yeah, I mean, you focus on your thing, you can like form your own personality, you do great things, and like many other good things follow. You don't focus so much like what other people think.
For sure. Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Sorry, say it again.
Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Good question. I guess there are like definitely different types of parties, different types of people that I would like to invite. I'm always like as one of the kind of odd like role models. I mean, let's forget the bad parts, but focus on the good parts. Is Linus Torvalds, like kind of who of course started Linux, and it's not only the kind of the success of the piece of software and the infrastructure, but especially like actually like the fact that like he has been first, I mean, doing it for such a long time. And the governance, and I mean, yes, I mean, his behavior has been like bad at times. Let's not focus on that part. I think he's improving as well. But I mean, just as a kind of like a social experiment that like somebody's able to kind of rally up such a huge number of people and like keep herding cats like for decades. I think that's something absolutely unique. Not the maybe the most like a fun like a dinner person, I guess, but I mean like I think it's just someone like who has like very sharp opinions as well. I mean, I think that would be always fun to hear.
Who made the biggest impact in your career?
Good question. I actually like oddly enough, like I started like doing this artificial intelligence stuff like at very early age. There was one professor, unfortunately, like he's already dead now. But I mean, like he kind of invited me to kind of start like reading about artificial intelligence and so forth. Like even like when I was really young, like still in kind of like early days in high school. So I owe much to him, to Timo Honkala, and like he was really a pioneer. He like so many things that like then ended up happening through LLMs, like already like way before. Unfortunately, like I never lived to see the day, and I wish he could. But I mean, like yeah, I mean, it's just like really important to have those influential characters, like also like early on, I mean, in your careers.
For sure. Where can we find you outside of work?
Good question. Like, well, I have 2 kids, so like most often, like you can find me at the Yerba Buena skating rink.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And I'm not the one skating, but my daughter is, and like so. I mean, most often, like you can just like find me there.
Love that. Well, Ville, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was such a master class for everything MLOps / building a community, open source, and just infra in general.
Like this was super fun. Thanks a lot, Grace.
Thank you. Let me quickly unstream 1 sec.